From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Flourish DX, Psych Health and Safety Canada. And I'm your host, Kim MacDonald, and today I'm very excited with our guest today, Dr. Manju Varma, and she is a nationally recognized expert in anti-discrimination. And I'm going to share a little bit more about her background, and then I'm going to ask her to share a little bit as well. So she, before her current position with the Nova Scotia Community College, she served as the New Brunswick Anti-Racism Commissioner and in a human rights role with the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. And she also serves on the board of the Canada Race Relations Foundation. So you have a pretty broad and deep history in some of the work that you're going to be bringing to the community college, Dr. Varma. So if you could share a little bit for our listeners about the journey that brought you here and some of your background.
Sure, yes. I guess, first of all, when I think of my work journey, I have to attach it to my personal journey because I didn't realize this till I started working, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, the things that I talk about, the things that I, wonder about, these are things that happened to me or didn't happen to me. And then my questions are, well, why didn't they happen to me? So my background is East Indian. My parents originally came from India, then settled in England. And then my parents came to Nova Scotia. And the reason being is that my father, there was a program in Nova Scotia that if you came and studied and became a teacher here in Nova Scotia, you would, once you were done, you would get a teaching position and you would get what we called at that time your landed immigrancy. I think it's called permanent residence now.
Okay.
And so, my father already had a degree, so it was a great opportunity to be able to come to Canada. He had a sister and brother-in-law in Truro, Nova Scotia, who were going to do the same thing. So that's how we arrived in Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, I guess nobody was sort of keeping track of numbers, and pretty soon there were more teachers than positions. So the government of Nova Scotia responded by letting go of all of their non-Canadian born teachers, regardless of tenure. So even though my dad had tenure, had several years experience, more so than some, new Canadian born teachers coming in, he was let go. There was a human rights case that the union brought forward, and they lost. So, fast forward now, 50 plus years later, and I find it ironic, but also great that I'm working in human rights in Nova Scotia again. So it's kind of come full circle. We moved to Moncton, New Brunswick. At the time, it was this growing, bustling city. My parents became entrepreneurs. So I grew up in New Brunswick. And in Moncton, while we had the communities of French and English, and so as a result, communities of Protestant and Catholic, that was about all of the diversity that was in the city. There were great divides. There were neighborhoods that were completely French, neighborhoods that were completely English. So certainly not a lot of inclusion or integration. And then as I went to school and I became a teacher, my first teaching job was with what's now Elsie Booktook. It was called Big Cove at the time. And I was teaching children, Indigenous children in their community, grade 4 and 5. And, it struck me very quickly, a couple of things. First of all, that I didn't know what I was doing. So I'm not only a young teacher, a new teacher, but I had zero training on how to teach children of a different background, in particular, Indigenous children. So, I would wonder things like, why aren't their parents coming for parent-teacher interview? Why, I would say say things either in my head or out loud, probably like, what's wrong with these people? Why don't they care about their kids? I had no knowledge at all about residential schools, the impact of public schooling on Indigenous people, the trauma of all that, because I never learned that. And I also never learned about how to teach children of a different culture. So that was one thing. The other thing I started to realize is, wow, like the curriculum that we're using, which is the provincial curriculum, has no reality for these children. We were reading books about, girls who wanted to be ballerinas living in a condo in Toronto. Like, what does that have to do with children who are living in communities where fetal alcohol syndrome is an issue? Alcoholism in general is an issue. Intergenerational trauma is an issue. Nothing, right? So then I decided to do my PhD in education and in anti-racist education and went off to Toronto. So to go from Moncton, New Brunswick to Toronto at that time, wow. So I started to see like, okay, I grew up, in a city where maybe there was 10, 12 East Indian families. And now I'm living in a city where a whole apartment might be East Indian people, where I can actually go and get groceries and for food that I want to make. But at the same time, I started to read, like I was reading the research for school, and a lot of the research, first of all, was American-based on anti-racism. And if it was Canadian, it took place in like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, not my reality. So that's where I guess my personal and my professional started to meld together. And I decided I wanted to really look at the experiences of people and communities who live in isolation, who don't have those supports, and this is before full use of the internet. So like even just getting a newspaper in your language would have been a challenge in a city like Moncton, but in a city like Toronto, you could do that. There was a place for worship. There was not so in New Brunswick, whether you were Muslim, Hindu, if you weren't Christian and perhaps Jewish, there really was no place for worship. There was no place for community to be built. So that really interested me because I realized the majority of Canada at that time was still like this. Still, Moncton wasn't an outlier. Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal and cities like that were the outliers. So, so that kind of put me on the professional path of working in this area, whether it was for the federal government, private. I taught at the University of New Brunswick for 7-8 years, and in education again, to work with upcoming teachers about how you do work in a multicultural classroom, how you think about diversity in your classroom, even when that diversity isn't there. Because we kind of followed this idea of, well, if there aren't refugee children in our classroom, we don't need to worry about it. Or if there aren't children where English is a foreign language for them, we don't need to worry about it. When really, we all should be talking about systemic racism. We should all be talking about the challenges that, that inclusion and diversity bring to a classroom, and how do we skill up to be able to meet those challenges. The other thing is, whenever I give my bio, I kind of feel like it should come with a grain of salt, because if you read my bio,
it's pretty impressive.
It is impressive. Okay. Yes.
Very impressive.
But that took 30 plus years. What I would love to see in my bio, and I always think about doing it, and maybe I will one day, maybe I'll do a sample here, is, yes, I worked for the federal government, and I worked in areas of multiculturalism and diversity and mental health, but I also switched positions a few times because I wasn't recognized for my talent. I wasn't in the no group. So I missed opportunities of promotion. So while it looks like I've climbed this ladder of success on paper, really I didn't.
Yes.
There were lots of times where I fell down a rung. I had like I said, I taught at UNB for 8 years, but at the same time, it was in a different city where my two babies were, and I was commuting back and forth because at that time we didn't think a lot about women having to balance careers and motherhood, especially motherhood of small children. We didn't think a lot about having good child care, and so while it does sound impressive, the last thing I want people to think is that this was an easy road. And I think it's so important that we share our difficult roads, because if you don't, if I look at your CV, Kim, and I'm like, oh, wow, look at all the things that Kim has done. She's traveled the world. She's had flourishing businesses. If I'm not aware of all of the hardships, of all of the valleys that come with those peaks, then I may start to wonder, what's wrong with me? Why is it taking me this long to get to this position?
I love that insight.
And I don't want people to think that when they see my bio. It was hard. There were promotions that I was passed up for. There were places where I worked where, even though I was working on diversity, was like an environment of systemic racism, an environment of systemic discrimination. I remember being at a new organization, a federal department. I won't name the department, but a federal department. And I was leaving work, and one of the employees that was there said to me, I was new, said to me, "Oh, you must be the Viz Min hire." And I said, "No, I'm the PhD hire." But I had been around for a while, right? I wasn't 22 years old. When I was 22 years old and heard comments like that, I pretended not to hear them.
Yeah.
Or, or internalize, okay, I have to work twice as hard now to prove that I deserve this position. Yeah. So, all that to say around, when you see people's bios, absolutely celebrate the accomplishments, but also know that in most cases, especially for members of marginalized communities, there's a lot of bad stuff that happened too. Right? So
thank you for that.
Yeah.
That is so important for us to talk about. And it's not always the things that come forward when anybody is talking in a business context or an organizational context. But I think that helps us just pause and slow down a little bit too. And also even it helps create internal personal reflection when you're listening to someone else's story too. And it also, I think it's a moment of connection. I think it's also a moment of connection, Dr. Varma, because it's so important for all of us. No one gets through most careers, a couple of decades of careers without having some of this, but some of us also have other things that are right there in front of us that we have to navigate. There's a quote that I saw from you that was around, if organizations can focus on inclusion, diversity will follow naturally.
Yes.
And maybe you could share a little bit about that, because I think that's an interesting part of the entire work that you're doing. And you see, we see, many of us see lots of organizations talking about diversity, incredibly important, but the inclusion component and what that actually viscerally feels like for people is where the lived experience is, I think, for many people in workplaces. And that connection, if it's there or not there, and how each of us are sort of helping everyone experience that. But I just love that quote, that inclusion before diversity.
Yeah, sure. No problem. I will tell you that you kind of went mute
Oh,
for a
did I?
moment.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you did.
Yeah. No, I just my thought was that I had read that you had said if organizations think more about inclusion and work on inclusion, that diversity will follow. And I
That's
just thought
right.
that was a interesting way of framing it, because we hear more about diversity conversations and the work of diversity than the work of inclusion. And how do you differentiate them? Or how would you describe the work in organizations of creating inclusion, and maybe relate it to some of the work that you're starting to do and are getting deeper in with the community college?
Absolutely. And actually, I will say that for the Nova Scotia Community College, that's what drew me to the position, was that it's priority on inclusion. I mean, of course, there was discussions around diversity, but even my department is, it's human rights, equity, and inclusion. The word diversity doesn't even show up. And there was a time, for sure. I mean, all conversations are evolutions, right? All relationships
Yes.
are evolutions.
Yep.
And there was a time we needed to talk about diversity because people were very comfortable being in environments where everybody looked like them. And for those of us who didn't look like everybody, we didn't say much, right? We didn't talk about our discomfort, and we were just happy to be included. So absolutely, there was a time to talk about diversity, but we live in a different world now. First of all, in Canada, we have a labor crunch. And so, for the first time in a long time, for many professions, many occupations, there are more jobs than people. So that changes, the balance of power a little bit. But with inclusion, people focused on putting those faces there, right? So let's have someone in a wheelchair. Let's have someone who, is not white. Let's have the older female, and you start checking off boxes. Well, that did a couple of things. First of all, it really increased the stereotype of people just getting positions because of the way that they looked, right? Which is ironic because people have often gotten positions for the way that they look. It's just that the way that they look is not, non-white, is not disabled. So able-bodied, white population, mainly English, have always gotten positions for the way they look. But for some reason, when we started talking about diversity, there was another conversation that started at the same time with, oh, well, are those, if we hire Manju for this position, are we hiring her because she's brown? Or are we hiring her because, she can bring something to the table? And unfortunately, the stereotype was often, well, because she was brown. So right away, you're starting off in a place where you're not seen as being there because of your skills. You're seen there as a representation of this checkbox, of this box we need to check off. And we see it in conversations. So, for example, I was sitting with managers at a table once, and we were talking, and it's not that long ago. I'm not talking 20 years ago, in the last couple of years. We were talking about summer students and representation in summer students. And we were discussing some processes or some strategies to hire more Indigenous students. And one of the managers said, I don't know, we hired an Indigenous student last year. He didn't work out. I don't know if I can get my team on board again to hire one this year, right? Now, would we ever say that about men? Or even women? Would we ever say, listen, I hired a female student last year. She didn't work out. So let's just look at the male resumes now.
Very interesting comment and to explore.
Yes. Yeah. And then the question is, well, why did that person not do well? Maybe that person didn't do well because they didn't have a work ethic. Or maybe they weren't skilled at the position. There's all sorts of reasons. But maybe they didn't do well because the supports were not there for them as well, because the workplace was not inclusive. Mm-hmm. And it's ironic because it comes out being the detriment of the people you're trying to help in the first place. So you try to make your workplace diverse. You're not inclusive in your workplace. And so those people leave. And then the common statements that we hear is, I did all this work to get someone with a disability into this position, and then they left. So I'm not doing that again. Right. Whereas if you said, how much work did I do to make this place inclusive? Mm-hmm. And these are not hard things to do. You know, there are some processes that require a lot of thought, a lot of changes, maybe policy changes, and those are difficult. They're work. But then there are other things that are low-hanging fruit. You know, yes. For example, my family celebrates Diwali, which is a Hindu festival. It's kind of like New Year's and Christmas mixed together, right? And it usually takes place at the end of October or beginning of November. So when I first started working in the public sphere, I would never ask for that time off. Like it would never even occur to me to ask that. So, you know, you'd work all day and then you rush home. Imagine working all day so that you can celebrate Christmas at night. You know, like most people get like Christmas Eve off and maybe even the day before Christmas Eve off, right? But imagine you're working and then you come home and have to celebrate Christmas, which is what, you know, my family and I had to do. As time went on and we started talking about diversity and inclusion, I actually last year asked for the day off, right? And my manager said, sure, like, you know, it'll come off at one of your vacation times. So it's a little bit of inclusion, but there was also a big meeting planned for that day. So I ended up coming in anyways, because it would be a detriment to my career to not be there. So that's a little bit of inclusion. More inclusion would have been to say, yes, you can take that day off and let's make sure there's nothing important going on that day. Right.
So the level of the change.
That's right. Even more inclusion would be, let's talk about holiday swapping, right? It depends on the work. Would you be interested in working Christmas Day and then you can have Diwali off and it does not come off your vacation time? That's even more inclusion, right?
Right.
So some of that's very easy. Yes, let's give you a day off. You can have it on your vacation time. And it's even pretty easy for most of us to be able to rearrange meetings because we know, you know, Manju's not going to be there, or it's Ramadan and certain people are not going to be there, or they're not going to be at their best because they are fasting all day. So let's not have any, you know, grand meetings or meetings that require travel during that time. Right to the big, let's look at some holiday swapping, which are HR issues. So that's a whole different level of inclusion. And what I love at NSCC, what I see happening is that level, that higher level of inclusion. So I'm super excited about being part of that. And I can give you an example. It was a meeting that we had yesterday. So we've been, my office has been meeting with communications, and because they're focused on a whole new branding of NSCC. So in the past, my office would not have been asked. Like, I don't mean just at NSCC, but, you know, in any organization, chances are branding and marketing would never reach out to the one person doing diversity, right?
Yes.
And if they did, it was like, do we have enough Black people? Do we have enough, you know, Asian people in our commercials? That sort of diversity
level, right?
Yeah, no inclusion, just diversity. But it was very different with the conversation that I had with the marketing people at NSCC. So first of all, we were invited to several meetings to give our viewpoint. It wasn't like, oh, here's what we're doing, so how, can you guys like diversify this up? It was not like that. It was like, what are some of the concerns that you have, and how can we work together to put out, the next phase of marketing? How can we reflect diversity? So yesterday we're having a conversation about an idea of having scripts, little videos of students who would be going to NSCC. So one of the videos is someone's first day. And all of that angst, right? Did I make the right choice? But as we were talking, they said to us, well, what about a video of someone coming in who is from a marginalized community, and they're asking questions in their head like, am I going to face any microaggressions? Who could I talk to if I need cultural support? We would have never thought about those years ago. So when I talk about like how far ahead NSCC is in inclusion and in equity, in creating safe spaces, it's just they're going to levels that I never really thought about. So I find that extremely exciting.
That is exciting. So I think that level of higher thinking or deeper thinking or wider thinking around inclusion, how can organizations, so you and I have talked about the link with psychological health and safety and how that is creating a safe space and people can be themselves and can also ensure that the organization isn't unintentionally creating harms through some of the things that they do. How does that link, or how do you see that link happening with the inclusion and the psychological health and safety for the work that you're doing?
That's a really good question. I guess I'll go back to last year when I was commissioner on systemic racism for New Brunswick, and looking at the trends and patterns, the extent and scope of systemic racism. And I did this through consultations. Many of the individuals that I spoke with and many of the organizations that I spoke with focused on safety. What did safety mean to them? And a very holistic or more complex idea of safety. So, for example, safe neighborhoods, what's that mean? Well, for some of us, that means well-lit parks, well-lit streets, so you can walk home in the dark and not be worried about, encountering any issues. But some of the people I spoke to also told me stories about other neighbors stopping them. And I heard this mainly among Black participants, so that their kids had been stopped in the neighborhood at night by other neighbors because they didn't think they belonged there. So these are obviously people that don't know each other, but safety should include being able to walk in your neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood. I like the idea that I can walk around my neighborhood and not worry that someone's going to see me and think, well, she doesn't look like she belongs here, right? Which is what these participants were telling me. There were stories about, or one participant telling me that her son was walking home around midnight, had a hoodie on, and somebody actually came out of their home and took a picture of him. Right, and then posted on their Facebook page, the neighborhood Facebook page, that this particular individual was out and he looked sketchy. Now, what is sketchy about this person, right? And so the mom actually responded and said, "That's my son. We have lived in this neighborhood for how many years. And I'd like to know what it is that you find sketchy about him," right? He's walking home and he has a hoodie on. So, of course, then everybody starts responding. Right?
Yes, it's brave. It's brave to respond sometimes.
Yes,
it's brave to respond. And that whole conversation probably with the person in their head about, should I respond? How do I respond?
How do I respond and still feel safe? Because
still
now
feel safe for responding.
Other neighbors came out in defense of this person who had taken a photo, because nobody wants to say, well, yeah, I took a photo of that person because he is Black and it's dark and he's wearing a hoodie. And so I made the racist assumption that he doesn't belong here. No one's going to come out and say that, even though that's exactly what rolled out, right? So I think we need to think about safety in some different places, seeing role models in the workplace. If you're working, and I've had this happen to me, where I'm working, I see other people get promoted. I look at management, they're all white. If I don't see role models in the place of work, if I don't see potential for me to move up, then that's a type of lack of safety as well, right? You don't have that career safety, that professional safety, that there is an opportunity for me here. There is an opportunity to make change here. And again, I heard that from many people last year in my role as commissioner, who said, like, yeah, that my work has a multicultural, potlucks, and they send out messages saying, "Oh, it's Ramadan," but I don't see anybody in the executive that looks like me, right? I have no thoughts that someone like me could end up in executive, because everyone seems to know each other. Their kids all know each other. The kids all go to the same school. So that isolation, that lack of promise, or the idea that your expertise is continuously overlooked. We do that with, foreign trade. I don't even like calling them foreign trade, internationally trained people, you don't have enough Canadian experience, so you can't have this position. So yeah, safety is more than just being able to get from point A to point B and not worry about your physical safety, right? It's about all those other things. Do you feel safe enough to go to your manager and ask if you could have Diwali off? Or do you feel exceptionally safe and say to your manager, I'd like to have Diwali off, and I also notice that there's a big meeting. Is there any way that we can move that meeting to the next day so that I can participate? And it's not just a race issue. People with disabilities feeling safe enough to have that conversation with their managers about having a disability, maybe feeling safe enough to say, this is what I can do and this is what I can't do. Or this is what I can do, but it takes me longer to do it. These are the supports that I need. So I think we really need to think beyond, and I mean, you do this work all the time, beyond just like physical safety, but how is my spiritual, how is my emotional safety also, how's my professional safety also protected in this workplace? And if it isn't, that and if you can, you need to move on, because it will grind you down.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Right.
And the impacts of chronic stress and the chronic stress impact of those feelings of exclusion or and other impacts and harms are pretty clear in the data.
Yes.
We know that, and we know what happens when those factors are not managed well and the risks to harms are not managed. For the Nova Scotia Community College, so if you get a complaint or if there is an issue, how does your office, like, that's also just coming forward with a complaint is a very brave step for any student to take, or a faculty member or an employee to take forward. How do you process, or how do you think about those things, or your team think about those things? Because that's, if there isn't safety, or if that language and conversation hasn't been happening, in the higher level for long enough, those early people, what kind of complaints, I guess, are you seeing, or what kind of things do people bring forward that they want your department to address?
Well, I'm going to preface that by saying I've been at the college for 2 months.
Yes,
So,
it's early days. Yeah.
It's early days for me. Yes. So I cannot walk you through the actual process because I have a fantastic manager who does that.
Yeah.
So first of all, I have an awesome team, and that's important, right? And a lot of my team members are first voice people. So, and what I mean by that is, we don't, when we talk about Indigenous issues, Mi'kmaq issues in Nova Scotia, we have someone who works for us from that community. Now, obviously, she's not going to represent the whole community. We don't want anyone to do that. But there's a first voice component.
Okay.
In the past, perhaps somebody at the executive director level, like, me in my position, might have been held by somebody who had never experienced discrimination, right? But now it is held by someone who has. So we talk about first voice experiences. From a process perspective, what I do know is that our team is very well versed. Those who deal with these complaints are very well versed in respectful community policies, very well versed in human rights. Like they understand what human rights mean. It's a word that we toss around a lot, but we have legal expertise that really understands what human rights means and how that involves everyone, right? And we have processes, we have policies, and when we see that a policy is lacking, we work to get towards that policy. So, for example, right now I know we're working on, what I guess a layperson would call a whistleblower policy.
Okay.
Because it is incredible, like as you point out, it's incredibly courageous to make a complaint. And we now know, through all the research that witnessing a harassment, witnessing discrimination, being a bystander can be just as traumatic as actually experiencing it yourself. So we do a lot of education around that, and we're going to do more education around that. And education is actually a really important part of the work that we want to do, because if we can avoid situations before they happen, so the proactive work, then our hope is that we can minimize complaints, or at the very, if the complaint comes through, be able to come up with a win-win, being able to mediate those conflicts at the lowest level so that people don't walk away victimized. People don't walk away traumatized, and that includes everyone, right? However, at the same time, there is an emphasis on everyone needs to come to the table. Right? This is not just work for marginalized people. It is not the responsibility of marginalized people to solve discrimination. Right? It is the responsibility of everyone. So that also means that for our faculty, staff, students who are in the majority of some privilege. So, for example, I'm able-bodied, right? It is my responsibility to understand the challenges and issues and my privilege of being able-bodied. So we know that through some of our numbers that we are getting more and more students who are on the autism spectrum.
Okay.
So using that data, it's like, okay, what's our responsibility? Well, our responsibility now is to start training our staff, to start training our faculty, to put in supports for people so that they understand how to work with people who are on the autism spectrum. It doesn't just put the onus on that student to say, okay, if something happens to you, here it is, here's this lovely department, you can come and make a complaint and we'll deal with it. No, it's far more holistic than that. It is about training faculty, training staff, because that creates safety for them as well, right? To say, okay, here are some tools, here's some knowledge that you need to have, because you're going to see more and more students who have certain challenges or come to the classroom in a different learning world than what you're used to. So by giving this education, we're protecting everyone. We're creating safe spaces for everyone. Because it's hard to talk about privilege. You hear privilege and you're kind of like, oh, you get your back up. And it's like, no, I'm not privileged. I worked really hard to get to where I am, just like we all did. But understanding someone's privilege or understanding your own privilege doesn't mean that you didn't have hardship. It means understanding that others had hardship, but that there's layers upon it that you never had to think about. So what I try to do is use the metaphor of a safety net. And I think of, when you used to go to the circus and you saw the trapeze artists and they had that safety net underneath. So I challenge people. I was like, okay, think of the most difficult situation that you have had in your life.
Okay.
All right.
I'm actually thinking.
Okay. Now, and you had a safety net underneath. Think about the safety net. And maybe the safety net was that you had access to therapy because you had a good medical plan. Or maybe your safety net was that your family was close by and able to help you. Right. Now I want you to think about people who also had to think about race. Right.
Okay.
And cut a hole in your safety net if you did not have to think about that.
Okay.
If in your most difficult time, if you didn't have to think about finances, if you didn't, cut a hole in your safety net. Right? So it's not so much about what you had and what you didn't have. It's about what does your safety net look like? Right? So I went through a divorce. My kids were tweens at the time. And as difficult as all that was, I was financially stable. My children were not having any issues in school. I did not have, I had my family close by, so I didn't have childcare issues that I needed to worry about. My best friend is a divorce lawyer, so I got really good advice. But then I thought, okay, what if I didn't have all those things? What if I was a single mom without all those things? So I'm a single mom. I'm dealing with divorce. I know how hard that is. But what if I didn't have a good job, right? What if I also had to deal with the stereotypes around single moms, which I didn't? What if my kids went through a really hard time and I had to get them therapy, or what if my kids had learning disabilities and I'm working with that at the same time? What if I wasn't safe and I had to leave the community, right? Then all of a sudden that most difficult time that I've had, and I'm not trying to undermine it. It was a difficult time, but my safety net was much different than what it could have been. So when I think about that, I think, how do we tighten the safety net for people? So if a woman is going through a divorce and she is fearful because of violence, how do we tighten her safety net? Well, we get supports in, we advocate for communities to have, places where women can go, safe places. What if the children are having a hard time? Well, let's get some supports into schools. So let's get everyone's safety net to look like what mine looked like. You're still going to go through a difficult time. It still really sucks, but you have a safety net. And I find when I talk about that rather than privilege, people are more on board.
I think visual analogies are so good for communicating difficult, sort of challenging concepts. I really love that safety net idea. How do you talk, or how would you help an organization talk to their managers when they're trying to work through some of those things? And so one individual or another has certain needs during a particular time in their career or their work life within that organization. And so the attention and the need of that person is different than others. And you put some of those things in place. And some of the conversation that I hear is around fairness. Well, equality or equalness versus, that someone can then maybe come into work a little bit later because they do have to now, as the sole parent, drop off their kid for daycare or to school. And that, I don't get that sort of benefit at this moment in time. How would you help managers who are struggling with that, trying to create psychological health and safety, really emphasizing mental health in the workplace and recognizing we have different needs at different times, but that sort of that crunchiness where this conversation of fairness and I want that, they have that, I would like to have that too. How do you navigate some of that conversation or that kind of friction that can happen within a workplace?
Yeah, and it does. It does. There's so much to unpack in what you said, like that, the equality.
Try
thing,
not to make it hard, easy for you.
Equality, yes. I mean, we learn from a really young age, right? Like fairness. You give one kid some candy and the other you don't. It's like, oh my God, it's not fair. My partner and I were talking about Easter egg hunts, and I'm like, okay, we have to have the same number of eggs for both grandkids, right? And so how are we going to do that? Because it's got to be fair.
I think we do that in so many parts of our lives.
We do.
Early, about the number, even if you're hunting for the eggs, it's like you want the two little toddlers to each get the same amount in their egg when you're looking for them. Like,
what if one toddler is just really good, right?
I know.
Don't
really
they deserve more eggs? Yeah, don't they deserve more eggs?
They absolutely
I don't know, right? I don't know if they deserve more eggs. So,
I kind of think they
bringing
do,
that,
but
I kind of think they do too. But bring that into the.
I know. So these are really.
It's
like we start at such a this cutting up the pie that that sort of that benefit is not pie. It's not pie and everybody gets an equal piece at the same time. So I know But
what if one person's hungrier than another? Or what if some person baked that pie? Shouldn't they get more of that pie? So
these are some of the translated analogies that we see playing out in workplaces.
Exactly.
And the fairness question is a really, I think I hear it a lot from managers about that struggle of communicating and behaving themselves in a way that can then support mental health at work and reducing the harms when you need to reduce the harms, or putting protective factors in place so that it doesn't have a negative impact on someone's mental health when they're in different places in their life. And there's lots of different scenarios, but that one is interesting, I think, to try to figure out. And many managers struggle with that, the question of, equality, equalness, and fairness,
When I've worked with managers on this, or organizations, regardless of what level, the first thing I talk about is the difference between equality and equity, right? So equality is everyone gets the same thing, and equity is everyone gets what they need, which can be very different things, right?
That's a great, clear message for managers.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing is, have these discussions before you have an issue. If you're going to make diversity, inclusion, equity a priority, then have these discussions before. Like, we have fire drills. When we were all in the office, we'd have fire drills. We didn't wait for a fire and then say, okay, now's the time to practice, right? We didn't. We said, okay, we need to practice. So when the real thing happens, people know what to do. Yes. So a message I try to get to organizations is start today. You don't need to have a big committee. You don't need to have policy changes. You can do that as time goes on. But today, start just using those words, because that's how we give people what they need in order to be the best that they are. So, there's a great cartoon on the internet, and you can Google it. Like, if you Google equality versus equity, there's a whole bunch. But one I love is one of everybody on the same bike, right? Okay. So you've got someone like me who's 5'2", and I'm on this bike, and it's working for me. It's at my right height. And then the person behind is like 6'2", and they're on the exact same bike, and they're all hunched over, and they're uncomfortable, and they can't move forward. And then you've got this little toddler on a bike and they're falling over because they really need a tricycle. So what the person who's 6'2" needs is a bigger bike, and the person who's a toddler needs 3 wheels, right? They don't need 2 wheels, they need 3 wheels. So in order for this family to go on a bike ride, everybody needs to have what they need, not all the same bikes. And it's the same thing at the workplace. If we're going to move forward, and we're going to move forward people's careers, their learning experience, the part of their life that they spend at work, that everyone should be getting what they need, not what everyone else is getting. So a great example of this is for a while in the public service, in the federal public service, everyone got like $1,000 for language training.
Okay.
But that was for everybody. So you could be perfectly officially bilingual, right? And you still get your $1,000, or you've come from a place where you've never even heard the other official language and you still get $1,000. Well, the people who were officially bilingual never spent it, because why would they, right? And the people that had grown up in a community, gone to school in a community in one official language and never heard the other official language, well, they still only got $1,000. That's not going to work for them. So now it's different. It's like, okay, if you don't need this money, that's great. You've reached your language efficiencies. That's not going to be a hurdle in your career. That's great. Let's look at maybe some other things that are going to be a hurdle. For the people who need more than that $1,000 package, let's give them more. Mm-hmm. So we're not, each person has equal opportunity to the next position, but they're given different supports to reach that opportunity. And that's what we need to think about. When we talk about equality, we often slip into colorblindness, right? Like, oh, I treat everyone the same. I've heard so many teachers say that. I think I said that as a teacher, and I'm sure I heard it in teacher school or, teacher education.
Yes.
Just treat everyone the same, right? But we know that the child who comes to school without breakfast and the child who comes to school with an iPad in their backpack are not the same. They do not have the equal access to opportunities. So you give them the same test, and the child who didn't have breakfast doesn't do as well as a child who has an iPad that can pull it out and do some research. And you say, okay, well, I treated you both the same, and you made an A and you failed. That's equality. That's not equity.
I love the notion of talking the preventative conversation.
Absolutely.
So
yes.
And the spread of the preventative conversation. It is one thing that we Canadians, that stereotype of Canadians, but it is true and shows up in the research too, that we do not like comfortable conversation or uncomfortable conversations.
No, we don't.
So, and we do like try to avoid them at all costs in many ways in the workplace, and having them earlier and having them before, like, that someone is in struggle, and having them in a broader way can create some fluency with talking about those kinds of things outside of a moment of, a complaint, or having that conversation and having it sort of shored up with the educational component that you mentioned. But I think it is talking about it more and having deeper conversations in a preventative sort of approach versus something happens and then we start to try to have the conversations after it. So where we can do those preventative conversations, and they really show up as protections. They end up being a protection because you've had the preventative conversation, and everyone understands what's going to happen when something happens.
And that's the other part, right? I mean, there are several pillars here. One pillar is the proactive education, whether it's through training, whether it's through conversation, mandatory training, that all depends on the organization. But the other pillars have to be there as well. Representation is, something you need to have you can't talk about inclusion and diversity and then look at your management table and have none of that there. So you need to have representation. And you need to have accountability so that if someone does say something, if they make a racist joke that or a comment, or they purposely choose not to hire somebody because of the way they look or because of their, they have a disability, that there is very clear processes on that. And that's one thing that we're working on, at NSCC. When you talked about the complaint process, we are doing our best. And like I said, I've got amazing people working on this to let's make this process clear. So no one is surprised that you can't make a racist joke in the classroom, or no one is surprised, and we laugh at that, but people are.
I know.
People are like, I was using that word, in reference to a text.
Clear.
Like, what were you thinking? Right. So all of those have to be there. The education, the accountability, like we will not allow microaggressions to happen in this workplace, right? This is what a microaggression looks like, and we won't allow it. If you instigate it, here are the steps, right? Those things have to be clear.
Yeah, that transparency and explicit communication. So not leaving things to assumptions or, having explicit communication, just functionally descriptive understanding of what that is and what the impact is, and also what the accountability and responsibility is for each of us. Those are, there's an infographic in there somewhere.
Probably.
I always raise that. Dr. Varma's like, there's an infographic in there. Well, this has been an amazing conversation.
Yes,
filled
thank
with
you.
great, good advice for workplaces. Really exciting to hear what's happening at the community college in Nova Scotia. It is a big system that's across the entire province, and there's 13 campuses. And
right. And one campus that's e-campus, so 14 in total.
Yes. That's wonderful. So it's sort of the breadth and it's a big challenge and a big big job to be thinking about these things in all of those pillars. But it's from an educational perspective, which is dear to my heart, and the community college system, which is also dear to my heart. So it has a special place in my heart. Love that these things are continuing to evolve. And I think that the work that you're going to be doing and the work that you're doing on a national level is amazing work. And it's exciting and challenging and hard and difficult and probably filled with struggle. And that's part of finding the joy in the work, with some of that difficult work that your team is doing is their challenge, for themselves in the workplace. But it's exciting. It's exciting times. So I'm so excited that you were able to share some of that with our listeners.
Thank you.
So if people wanted to reach out to you, how would they reach out to you?
They can contact me at NSCC. And if they are interested in the school itself, I would be happy to pass on, their emails wherever they're interested in. If they're interested in what the school is doing, what the college is doing to become more inclusive, they can certainly contact me. So it's my first name, Manju, Manju. My last name is Varma, V as in Victor, Arma. So it's manju.varma@nscc.ca.
All right.
But you can also look me up on LinkedIn. And
that's great. Yes, LinkedIn is awesome for, finding and connecting.
I think that's how we connected, wasn't it?
It is. It's how we connected. So thank you so much for all of your thoughts and ideas and the wisdom today, and exciting days ahead. So I appreciate that very much. Yeah. And thank you for all of our listeners who tuned in from wherever you get your podcasts. And I just wanted to close with sharing that you can reach out to me on LinkedIn as well, or at 13 Factors, my company. And thank you for coming and listening to this episode. And you can also, while you're here, take a listen to other episodes and other topics that we cover here on the podcast. And have a great week. And we'll talk to you again soon, and check back in, and also share this particular episode if you're interested with colleagues. And that's how we reach more and more people with the message of psychological health and safety in Canada. Thanks a lot. And till next time.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.